The Great Siege of Malta took place in 1565 when the Ottoman Empire tried to invade the island of Malta, then held by the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights, with approximately 2,000 foot soldiers, many of which Spanish, and 400 Maltese men, women and children, withstood the siege and expelled the invaders. This victory became one of the most celebrated events in 16th-century Europe. Voltaire said, "Nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta, and it undoubtedly contributed to the eventual erosion of the European perception of Ottoman invincibility and marked a new phase in Spanish domination of the Mediterranean." The siege was the climax of an escalating contest between a Christian alliance and the Islamic Ottoman Empire for control of the Mediterranean, a contest that included Turkish admiral and privateer Dragutt's attack on Malta in 1551, and the Ottoman utter destruction of an allied Christian fleet of the Battle of Jabar in 1560. The Knights of Malta. The Knights Hospitaller are also known as the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes and of Malta, or Knights of Malta, Knights of Rhodes, Knights of St. John, and Chevaliers of Malta. By the end of 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, had forcibly ejected the Knights from their base on Rhodes after the 6-month siege of Rhodes. From 1523 to 1530 the order lacked a permanent home. They became known as the Knights of Malta when, on the 26th of October 1530, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Grand Master of the Knights, sailed into Malta's Grand Harbour with a number of his followers to lay claim to Malta and Gozo, which had been granted to them by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in return for one full consent annually to the Viceroy of Sicily and a solemn Mass to be celebrated on All Saints' Day. Charles also required the Knights to garrison Tripoli on the North African coast, which was in territory that the Barbary corsairs, allies of the Ottomans, controlled. The Knights accepted the offer reluctantly. Malta was a small, desolate island, and for some time, many of the Knights clung to the dream of recapturing Rhodes. Nevertheless, the order soon turned Malta into a naval base. The island's position in the center of the Mediterranean made it a strategically crucial gateway between East and West, especially as the Barbary corsairs increased their forays into the western Mediterranean throughout the 1540s and 1550s. In particular, the corsair Dragut was proving to be a major threat to the Christian nations of the central Mediterranean. Dragut and the Knights were continually at loggerheads. In 1551, Dragut and the Ottoman Admiral Sanar decided to take Malta and invaded the island with a force of about 10,000 men. After only a few days, however, Dragut broke off the siege and moved to the neighboring island of Gozo, where he bombarded the Cittadella for several days. The Knights governor on Gozo, Gelation de Sessa, having decided that resistance was futile, threw open the doors to the Cittadella. The corsairs sacked the town and took virtually the entire population of Gozo into captivity. Dragut and Sanar then sailed south to Tripoli, where they soon seized the Knights' garrison there. They initially installed a local leader, Aga Murat, as governor, but subsequently Dragut himself took control of the area, expecting another Ottoman invasion within a year. Grand Master of the Knights Wanda Homedes ordered the strengthening of Fort St. Angelo at the tip of Birgu. The two new forts were built in the remarkably short period of 6 months in 1552. All three forts proved crucial during the Great Siege. The next several years were relatively calm, although the guerre de course, or running battle, between Muslims and Christians continued unabated. In 1557 the Knights elected Jean Paraissot de Valette Grand Master of the Order. He continued his raids on non-Christian shipping, and his private vessels are known to have taken some 3,000 Muslim and Jewish slaves during his tenure as Grand Master. By 1559 Dragut was causing the Christian powers such distress, even raiding the coasts of Spain, that Philip II organized the largest naval expedition in 50 years to evict the corsair from Tripoli. The Knights joined the expedition, which consisted of about 54 galleys and 14,000 men. This ill-fated campaign climaxed in the Battle of Jabbar in May 1560, when Ottoman Admiral Pile Pasha surprised the Christian fleet off the Tunisian island of Jabbar, capturing or sinking about half the Christian ships. The battle was disaster for the Christians, and it marked the high point of Ottoman domination of the Mediterranean. Toward the siege, after Jabbar, there could be little doubt that the Turks would eventually attack Malta again. In August 1560, Jean de Valette sent an order to all the orders priories that their knights prepare to return to Malta as soon as a citation was issued. The Turks made a strategic error in not attacking at once, while the Spanish fleet lay in ruins, as the 5-year delay allowed Spain to rebuild her forces. Meanwhile, the Spaniards continued to prey on Turkish shipping. In mid-1564, Romegus, the order's most notorious seafarer, captured several large merchantmen, including one that belonged to the chief eunuch of the Seraglio, and took numerous high-ranking prisoners, including the governor of Cairo, the governor of Alexandria, and the former nurse of Sultan Sulayman's daughter. By early 1565, Grandmaster de Valette's network of spies in Constantinople had informed him that the invasion was imminent. De Valette set about raising troops in Italy, laying in stores and finishing work on Fort St. Angelo, Fort St. Michael, and Fort St. Elmo. The armies, the Turkish Armada, which set sail from Constantinople on the 22nd of March, was by all accounts one of the largest assembled since antiquity. According to one of the earliest and most complete histories of the siege, that of the order's official historian Giacomo Bosio, the fleet consisted of 193 vessels, which included 131 galleys, 7 galleots and 4 galleasses, the remainder being transport vessels, etc. Contemporary letters from Don Garcia, the Viceroy of Sicily, give similar numbers. The Italian mercenary Francisco Balbird I Correggio gave the forces as the Knight Ippolito Sanz. In a lesser-known account, also lists about 48,000 invaders, although it is not clear how independent his work is from Balbi's. Other contemporary authors give much lower figures. In a letter written to Philip II only 4 days after the siege began, de Valette himself says that the number of soldiers that will make land is between 15,000 and 16,000, including 7,000 arquebusiers or more. That is 4,000 janissaries and 3,000 spahis. On the other hand, in a letter to the Prior of Germany a month after the siege, de Valette writes, this fleet consisted of 250 ships, triremes, biremes and other vessels. The nearest estimate we could make of the enemy's force was 40,000 fighting men. That de Valette gives the enemy fleet as 250 vessels, a number much above anyone else's, shows that the Grand Master himself was not above exaggeration. Indeed, a letter written during the siege by the liaison with Sicily, Captain Vincenzo Anastagi, states the enemy force was only 22,000, and several other letters of the time give similar numbers. However, Bosio arrives at a total of about 30,000, which is consistent with Balbi's named troops. Another early history gives essentially the same figure. The siege, arrival of the Ottomans before the Turks arrived, de Valette ordered the harvesting of all the crops, including unripened grain, to deprive the enemy of any local food supplies. Furthermore, the knights poisoned all wells with bitter herbs and dead animals. The Turkish Armada arrived at dawn on Friday the 18th of May, but did not at once make land. The first fighting broke out on the 19th of May. A day later, the Ottoman fleet sailed up the southern coast of the island, turned around and finally anchored at Marsaxlokk Bay, nearly 10 kilometers from the Great Port, as the Grand Harbour was then known. According to most accounts, in particular Balbi's, a dispute arose between the leader of the land forces, the fourth vizier Serdar Kızılahmetli Mustafa Pasha, and the supreme naval commander, Pile Pasha, about where to anchor the fleet. Pyle wished to shelter it at Marsamxett Harbour, just north of the Grand Harbour, in order to avoid the Sirocco and be nearer the action. But Mustafa disagreed, because to anchor the fleet there would require first reducing Fort St. Elmo, which guarded the entrance to the harbour. Mustafa intended, according to these accounts, to attack the unprotected old capital Mdina, which stood in the centre of the island, then attack Fort St. Angelo and Michael by land. If so, an attack on Fort St. Elmo would have been entirely unnecessary. Nevertheless, Mustafa relented, apparently believing only a few days would be necessary to destroy St. Elmo. After the Turks were able to emplace their guns, at the end of May they commenced a bombardment. It certainly seems true that Suleiman had seriously blundered in splitting the command 3 ways. He not only split command between Pyle and Mustafa, but he ordered both of them to defer to Dragut when he arrived from Tripoli. Contemporary letters from spies in Constantinople, however, suggest that the plan had always been to take Fort St. Elmo first. In any case, for the Turks to concentrate their efforts on it proved a crucial mistake. While the Ottomans were landing, the Knights and Maltese made some last-minute improvements to the defences of Birgu and Sengli. The Ottomans set up their main camp in Marsa, which was close to the Knights' fortifications. In the following days, the Ottomans set up camps and batteries on Santa Margherita Hill and the Cyprus Peninsula. The attacks on Birgu began on the 21st of May, while Sengli was first attacked a day later. Capture of Fort St. Elmo, having correctly calculated that the Turks would seek to secure a disembarkation point for their fleet, and would thus begin the campaign by attempting to capture Fort St. Elmo. De Valette sent reinforcements and concentrated half of his heavy artillery within the fort. His intent was for them to hold out for a relief promised by Don Garcia, Viceroy of Sicily. The unremitting bombardment of the fort from 36 guns on the higher ground of Mount Cyprus began on the 27th of May, and reduced the fort to rubble within a week. But De Valette evacuated the wounded nightly and resupplied the fort from across the harbour. After arriving in May, Dragut set up new batteries to imperil the ferry lifeline. On the 3rd of June, a party of Janissaries managed to seize the fort's ravelin and ditch. Still, by the 8th of June, the Knights sent a message to the Grand Master that the fort could no longer be held, but were rebuffed with messages that St. Elmo must hold until the reinforcements arrived. Finally, on the 23rd of June, the Turks seized what was left of Fort St. Elmo. They killed all the defenders, totaling over 1,500 men, but spared 9 knights whom the corsairs had captured, and a few others managed to escape. Balbir writes that Dragut died shortly after the victory. According to Bosio, a lucky shot from Fort St. Angelo mortally wounded him on the 18th of June, whereas according to Balbir and Sands, friendly fire from Turkish cannons while he was directing operations on Cyprus was the cause. Although the Turks did succeed in capturing St. Elmo, allowing Pyle to anchor his fleet in Marsamxett, the siege of Fort St. Elmo had cost the Turks at least 6,000 men, including half of their Janissaries. Mustafa had the bodies of the knights decapitated and their bodies floated across the bay on mock crucifixes. In response, De Valette beheaded all his Turkish prisoners, loaded their heads into his cannons and fired them into the Turkish camp. Panicked by this time, word of the siege was spreading. As soldiers and adventurers gathered in Sicily for Don Garcia's relief, panic spread as well. There can be little doubt that the stakes were high, perhaps higher than at any other time in the contest between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England wrote, "All contemporary sources indicate the Turks intended to proceed to the Tunisian fortress of La Goleta and wrest it from the Spaniards." And Suleiman had also spoken of invading Europe through Italy. However, modern scholars tend to disagree with this interpretation of the siege's importance. H.J.A. Sire, a historian who has written a history of the order, is of the opinion that the siege represented an overextension of Ottoman forces, and argues that if the island had fallen, it would have quickly been retaken by a massive Spanish counterattack. Although Don Garcia did not at once send the promised relief, he was persuaded to release an advance force of some 600 men. After several attempts, this Piccolo Soccorso managed to land on Malta in early July and sneak into Bergu, raising the spirits of the besieged garrison immensely. The Sangli Peninsula. On the 15th of July, Mustafa ordered a double attack against the Sangli Peninsula. He had transported 100 small vessels across Mount Cyprus to the Grand Harbour, thus avoiding the strong cannons of Fort St. Angelo, in order to launch a sea attack against the promontory using about 1,000 Janissaries, while the Corsairs attacked Fort St. Michael on the landward end. Luckily for the Maltese, a defector warned de Valette about the impending strategy, and the Grand Master had time to construct a palisade along the Sangli promontory, which successfully helped to deflect the attack. Nevertheless, the assault probably would have succeeded had not the Turkish boats come into point-blank range of a sea-level battery of 5 cannons that had been constructed by Commander Chevalier de Guiral at the base of Fort St. Angelo with the sole purpose of stopping such an amphibious attack. Just 2 salvos sank all but one of the vessels, killing or drowning over 800 of the attackers. The land attack failed simultaneously when relief forces were able to cross to Fort St. Michael across a floating bridge, with the result that Malta was saved for the day. The Turks by now had ringed Bergu and Sangli with some 65 siege guns and subjected the town to what was probably the most sustained bombardment in history up to that time. Having largely destroyed one of the town's crucial bastions, Mustafa ordered another massive double assault on the 7th of August, this time against Fort St. Michael and Bergu itself. On this occasion, the Turks breached the town walls and it seemed that the siege was over, but unexpectedly, the invaders retreated. As it happened, the cavalry commander Captain Vincenzo Anastagi, on his daily sortie from Umdina, had attacked the unprotected Turkish field hospital, massacring the sick and wounded. The Turks, thinking the Christian relief had arrived from Sicily, broke off their assault. St. Michael and Bergu. After the attack of the 7th of August, the Turks resumed their bombardment of St. Michael and Bergu, mounting at least one other major assault against the town on 19 to 21 August. What actually happened during those days of intense fighting is not entirely clear. Bradford's account of the climax of the siege has a mine exploding with a huge blast, breaching the town walls and causing stone and dust to fall into the ditch, with the Turks charging even as the debris was still falling. He also has the 70-year-old de Valette saving the day by leading towards the Turks some 100 troops that had been waiting in the piazza of Bergu. Balbia, in his diary entry for the 20th of August, says only that de Valette was told the Turks were within the walls. The Grand Master ran to the threatened post where his presence worked wonders. Sword in hand, he remained at the most dangerous place until the Turks retired. Bosio also has no mention of the successful detonation of a mine. Rather, in his report, a panic ensued when the townspeople spied the Turkish standards outside the walls. The Grand Master ran there, but found no Turks. In the meantime, a cannonade atop Fort St. Angelo, stricken by the same panic, killed a number of townsfolk with friendly fire. Fort St. Michael and Umdina. The situation was sufficiently dire that, at some point in August, the Council of Elders decided to abandon the town and retreat to Fort St. Angelo. De Valette, however, vetoed this proposal. If he guessed that the Turks were losing their will, he was correct. Although the bombardment and minor assaults continued, the invaders were stricken by an increasing desperation. Towards the end of August, the Turks attempted to take Fort St. Michael, first with the help of a Manta, a small siege engine covered with shields, then by use of a full-blown siege tower. In both cases, Maltese engineers tunneled out through the rubble and destroyed the constructions with point-blank salvos of chain shot. At the beginning of September, the weather was turning and Mustafa ordered a march on Mdina, intending to winter there. However, the attack failed to occur. The poorly defended city fired its cannon at the approaching Turks. This bluff scared them away by fooling the already demoralized Turks into thinking the city had ammunition to spare. By the 8th of September, the Turks had embarked their artillery and were preparing to leave the island, having lost perhaps a third of their men to fighting and disease. Gran Soccorso. On the 7th of September, Don Garcia had at last landed about 8,000 men at St. Paul's Bay on the north end of the island. The so-called Grande Soccorso positioned themselves on the ridge of San Paul Tartaga, waiting for the retreating Turks. It is said that when some hot-headed knights of the relief force saw the Turkish retreat and the burning villages in its wake, they charged without waiting for orders from Ascanio della Corna. Della Corna had no choice but to order a general charge, which resulted in the massacre of the retreating Turkish force. The Turks fled to their ships and from the islands on the 11th of September. Malta had survived the Turkish assault, and throughout Europe people celebrated what would turn out to be the last epic battle involving Crusader knights.